Second half of The Arena. With a wake-up call about homegrown terror, people seem to be conveniently forgetting in the wake of ISIS and their ilk. Something as simple as license plates joining the discourse about racism, and the conversation worth having about how we try to save a land where women are still treated like vermin, and human rights are nothing more than words. Our guest for this portion of The Arena, as a young man he was enamored with and joined the skinhead movement. After losing his brother to violence, decided there had to be a better way. He is author of the upcoming book, Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. Let's welcome Christian Picciolini to the show. Also next up, New York criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, and host of Talking Law Radio, Daniel Hochheiser. And here in studio from PoliticalHype.com, political strategist Mariana Mancuso. I thank you all for joining us here today. Let's make sure that we got everybody in. Everybody's brought in, I guess. There we go. I see Chris. I see Dan. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Mariana is here in the studio. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start off. Mariana, I'll get you to start off on this right now. The Afghani president is in the United States right now telling America, we need you to stay. We need your money. We need your troops, because if you leave, things will get worse. This is a society in Afghanistan that recently took a 27-year-old woman, they beat her, they stomped on her, they drove over her, they burned her to death for allegedly burning a Quran. Why should we be helping a regime that is this brutal towards women and human rights?
You know, that's the problem, is that she was allegedly being told that she was burning a Quran, and it had erupted from an argument she was having with a gentleman in the street who was selling different types of pendants and things to women, and then an entire gang of people jumped in and brutally beat her to death, and now there's an investigation. So I think, you know, he's saying you have to come in and help us, but really, can we help them when look at what's already going on? If we go in there, is that going to just cause a bigger problem? And these are things that this has now become their version of a war on women, and she's being used as almost, I hate to use the word martyr, but she's being perceived as such because she died in vain, and in fact she was a religious studies teacher, and to have this happen is just a horrible thing. Christian,
let me go ahead and bring this to you right now, because you've been in a very violent situation before when you were with the skinheads here, and this is violence. Let's get right down to it. This is treating women like dirt at this point. So why should we even bother? Should we basically, some people would say, leave them to their own devices and get out of Afghanistan? They're not worth saving.
I think to mirror Mariana, you know, I think she's right. I think as Americans, the best thing that we can do is to shed light on the situation that's happening in a tragedy. This is, you know, a woman who allegedly burned a Quran and didn't, and was victimized by mob action for what, you know, she supposedly did. And I think as Americans, by going in and trying to sort out their rule of law would be a mistake.
All right, now, Dan, that comes to you, I guess, when it comes down to the rule of law here, because that's what we're talking about in that country. That is their rule of law, yet it is a human rights travesty at this point. We're not going to change it, right?
We're not in the short term, which is unfortunate, because the fundamentalist Islamic peoples in the Middle East and Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, all over the Middle East, except for Israel, they squash all dissent. They don't permit any dissent, whether it's religious dissent, as in this case, or any other differences of opinion with the government or with the official religion. And it's really difficult to operate in a region like that where no discourse besides the official religious autocratic regime is permitted.
Do we need to then, and I've got about a minute left, we'll take a break, come back, we've got more, but Dan, to you first, very briefly, should we take into account the human rights records of all of these countries, no matter who they are, how good they are to us, when we consider doing business with them?
Absolutely, and particularly when we consider who we're going to give taxpayers' hard-earned dollars to, because if we're supporting regimes that are perpetrating atrocities on their women and others, then why should our taxpayers fund that?
Christian, same thing to you.
Absolutely, 100%. I think this is a human rights issue that we need to make the world aware of, but it certainly wouldn't support stepping in as an American country and trying to change their rule of law.
30 seconds to you, Mariana. I guess it's going to be consistent here. Let's make sure that we look at the human rights. But then again, can you really do business around the world these days, having that kind of a line?
That's kind of the problem. It almost forces us to put a border up and become isolationist as a country. So we have to be really cautious. At the same time, we can't aid in this, and we can't say that this is an acceptable form of the way that you're going to treat women in their society.
And people will always snap back at us and say, America is not perfect either. But guess what? Last time I checked, America is still a little bit better than burning somebody and running them them over in the middle of a street somewhere just to make a point
Right.
about a religious book. All right. A little bit more coming up. Christian Picciolini will join us. Daniel Hochheiser is here. Mariana Mancuso is here in the studio. When we come back, it is only a license plate. That's all it is. But it's a license plate in Texas that has people screaming about racism and the Supreme Court's involved. That and more when we come back right here on MidPoint. Welcome back to the arena, everybody. We are back. New York criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, host of Talking Law Radio, Daniel Hochheiser, author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead, Christian Picciolini joins us. And here in studio from PoliticalHype.com, political strategist Mariana Mancuso. I'm going to go ahead this time, and I'm going to start with you, Christian, because this specifically talks to your book and a lot of what's out there. We keep hearing the phrase skinheads every now and then, but right now it's buried under ISIS and so many other homegrown terrorists. You were involved with these groups for so many years. The fact that we don't hear much about them anymore in America, is that almost naive of us? Do we need to, every time we talk about homegrown terror, stop worrying about the ISIS killers who are leaving and worry about the skinheads who are here in America?
No, I certainly don't think we should take our eye off the ball. In fact, the FBI released a report this year that named the top 15 perceived terror threats in our country, and Islamists were not number one. As a matter of fact, sovereign citizens and skinheads and Ku Klux Klan and far-right groups dominated that list from number 1 to number 12. And you know, it's certainly something that in this climate, in this political climate, it's something we need to be very careful of and not take our eye off the ball.
In a political climate, then, Christian, what needs to be done in order to make sure that these groups are not overlooked? Because many times it seems they never, ever get mentioned in the conversation.
Well, I think that they certainly do get mentioned. We saw evidence of that last week in Mesa, Arizona, with the shooter who was a white supremacist. We heard about it when Wade Michael Page walked into a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and murdered innocent people. It's something that's happening, and it's something that we need to pay a lot of attention to because, you know, right now with our political climate, a lot of people in this country aren't happy, and when people aren't happy, they try to find a different way and don't take responsibility for their actions and are always blaming somebody else. So I think we need, as a country and as a government and as a society, we need to look at what's happening within our own borders, because I think we're fostering the same type of extremism here that's happening in other countries.
Mariana, I think that's a good point, too, because we are always talking about what happens here in our borders. We were talking so much about that, yet those groups are out there. They are still creating mayhem and terror, yet we hear so much focus on ISIS, 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 when there's not a lot of evidence that there's a lot of ISIS infiltration here in America. We've got to focus, and our politicians have got to focus on the real issues.
We have to focus on domestic issues as well as foreign policy. We've seen that this administration has been completely lackluster with their foreign policy issues, and when it comes to domestic issues, he's been a little bit more involved because we know that he wants to make sure that his party can maintain control of the White House, but unfortunately, it is really sad to say, until these groups start making more of a ruckus, if, you know, for example, we have the Boston Marathon bomber that's making a lot of headlines right now, and people are really outraged about that. And these little incidents that are isolated, everybody is looking at them while they're on the front page, but the minute they come off the front page, people turn a blind eye, except in Ferguson. Ferguson has maintained a state above the fold for a very long time, and now it's police violence, and it's turned into a race issue. And that's kind of the problem here, is unless it's called a race issue, from the blacks to the whites, you're not having people really wanting to talk about those things. They want to just kind of turn a blind eye and say, this was an isolated incident, it's not going to happen again.
Dan, I guess I also turn to you now from a legal perspective with about a minute to go here, because many people I talk to say that when it comes to these groups, they fly under the radar because legally you don't have law enforcement really going after them. They seem to be doing other things instead of sometimes spending the time they need to go after these real homegrown terrorists.
Well, law enforcement does have limited resources, and they focus their resources where they think the threat priority is. These days, that threat priority appears to be fundamentalist Islamist terrorism around the world and in the United States. I think the feds do always have their eye on the white supremacists, the skinheads, and have used our RICO laws, our racketeering laws, to rein in those groups. And I think it's to the feds' credit that you're not hearing as much about those groups.
Christian, 15 seconds. Would you call skinheads in this country a threat priority?
Absolutely. I think that skinheads and white nationalists and sovereign citizens are all one and the same. And I believe that they're a bigger threat than any Islamist terrorism within our own borders.
That is frightening. We got to spend a lot more time talking about this, and we will. Okay, gentlemen, please stand by. Christian Picciolini joins us. Daniel Hochheiser joins us. Mariana Mancuso is here in the studio. When we come back, let's go ahead and look at something a little bit different here. That aforementioned license plate issue in Texas, and somebody who says maybe a license plate that says bongs for Jesus. We're back with a very messy desk with political strategist from politicalhype.com. Mariana Mancuso joins us in the studio. Also joining us from New York and other places well beyond, New York criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, host of Talking Law Radio, Daniel Hochheiser, and author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead, Christian Picciolini joins us. Dan, I'm going to get this to you first up. Here we go. The Supreme Court is looking at a license plate in Texas that has a Confederate flag on it. Texas will not issue the license plate bearing the flag. The justices are wondering whether or not this becomes an offensive message. And as a matter of fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, well, if that's okay, what about bong hits for Jesus? Maybe that'll make a license plate next. Is this really something that generates people and incites violence? That's the big question.
I don't think so, but I think the issue that the Supreme Court is going to have to answer is whether the symbol of the Confederacy on the license plate is the state speaking or is it the driver of the car speaking. If it's the state speaking, then the state can speak what they want to speak and not run afoul of the First Amendment. If it's the individual who's driving the car speaking, then we have a First Amendment problem. I think, however, that the court will say that this is state speech, not individual speech, and that the state has a right to regulate these plates.
How about it, Christian? Let's be honest about it. You and I both know, and a lot of people know, that there are people around this country, people that you even dealt with for many years, who use the Confederate flag as a symbol of violence and racism.
Yeah, I support the First Amendment, but this is, with the First Amendment right comes a responsibility not to terrorize other people. That flag, frankly, was a symbol of terror in this country where we did drag people behind our truck and we did burn them on the streets like they're doing in Afghanistan. And it certainly wouldn't be something that I would support. And I agree that this is, if it's a personal issue, then that's one thing, but this is a state-supported initiative that probably shouldn't be allowed.
All right, Marianne, I throw it to you now. People are going to be out there, and I know there's people out there saying, wait a minute, it is my right to use that because it is something that is a symbol of pride for people in the Deep South.
That is true. You know, growing up in the South, I think we talked about this during break, after the end of high school, all of the quote-unquote rednecks would do a parade of the Confederate flag
Better be careful
down the
now,
street.
you just used the word rednecks. You can upset some people.
I'm going to use that in quotation. And, you know, as high schoolers, we never thought anything of it. Now, this going to a license plate, you cannot have a license plate that allows you to offend things. First of all, if you have on your license plate a vanity plate that talks about drug use or using, you know, inappropriate words. Now, the license plate being owned by the state, if the Supreme Court does see this, yes, it is a First Amendment issue. But again, you cannot offend the driver because then if you're driving, does it become a distraction? Are you like, is that person part of a skinhead or are they just proud to be from the Deep South? And so there's a very fine line that they have to walk.
Okay, I only got 1 minute left. I got one last thing. Everybody's going to get about 15 seconds on this. George Zimmerman, Mariana, says that it's Barack Obama's fault that he created a tremendous amount of problems with racism. And George Zimmerman says it's Barack Obama's fault that I am being persecuted. What do you think?
I think he's trying to maintain his 15 minutes of fame.
And I think his 15 minutes of fame might be up. Okay, I think that'd be the bigger problem here. Christian, I'll get it to you right now. It's interesting because some people say that the president is the one who did help drive some of the racist attitudes in this country. Does he have a point?
No, I mean, I think Zimmerman's a guy who's comparing himself to Anne Frank and is just looking for his fame. And, you know, this is a guy that just needs to go away and learn to live his life quietly, I think.
Wait a minute now. Do you think he actually can live quietly? He's shown at this point that he hasn't quite learned that lesson yet, right?
No, and you know, probably to his own demise at some point. I mean, this is a guy who's constantly in the news for things that are negative and nothing that's positive. And my issue with George Zimmerman is that he needs to go out and do something positive if he wants the attention.
Dan Hochheiser, you're the lawyer. If you were sitting there looking at George Zimmerman across the table, would you basically put your fingers to your lips and go, "Shut up, George"?
Well, I think George Zimmerman needs to come to terms with his problems are self-created. The problem that he created was following Trayvon Martin. and not letting the police do their jobs and trying to play vigilante police officer. On the other hand, I do think he does have a point that President Obama, as well as our mayor here, de Blasio, have made some misstatements in these very controversial racial
Okay, and we're going to
killings
have to
not
leave it there
helped.
because we are all out of time. Dan Hochheiser, Christian Picciolini, Mariana Mancuso, thanks so much for joining us. The arena is now closed, but the third hour of MidPoint continues after this.